Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this lecture in the very last week of a long year. My name's Nicholas Kirby. I'm here just to introduce Bob. But first of all, to just briefly say something about the Building Integrity Project, which is that has just begun here at BSG. So, Building Integrity Project is a program that we began in April. It's an 18-month pilot project. And the aim of the project is to try to approach the issues of corruption and related issues from a different angle. And that is instead of starting off with the question, how do we limit corruption? How do we limit the negative? We're starting with the idea of, well, what happens, or the question of what happens if we seek to try and maximise the positive or increase the positive, that is, integrity. So within that broader project, we're trying to answer questions like, what is institutional integrity? Is it simply the absence of corruption, or is it something that involves a whole lot of other positive institutional notions? And having defined it, how do we measure it? What does it cause? And finally, if it's a good thing, how do we go about promoting it within institutions? The work we'll be doing is a combination of research and also practitioner engagement. And the ultimate goal of the current project is to seed a permanent program within the Blavatnik School of Government. We couldn't imagine a better way to kick off our public events than to have Robert Klitgaard here today to speak about building integrity, learning from success. Professor Klitgaard's usual post is as the University Professor at Claremont Graduate University, where he served as the President from 2005 to 2009. He has also served as the Dean of the Pardee Rand Graduate School, the Lee Ka-ching Distinguished Chair Professor at the National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, the Lester Crown Professor of Economics at Yale's School of Organisation and Management, and he was the Associate Professor of Public Policy and Special Assistant to the President at Harvard. His 10 books include Tropical Gangsters, which was one of the New York Times Book Review's Books of the Century. Bob is visiting Blavatnik for about a month here in June, where he's working on a book tentatively entitled What Will Work Here? How can policy analysis and evaluation be recast to combine outside knowledge and local knowledge in ways that kindle creative problem solving? The book uses examples from many policy areas to try to shed new practical light on topics such as public-private collaboration, taking culture into account, and dealing with disadvantage and stigma. A key element is what he calls convenings, and these are carefully planned events that bring data, examples of success, and analytical frameworks to decision makers, enabling them to reframe issues and take local context into account. Before we begin, Bob did ask whether we could have handouts, and I said, oh, of course we could have handouts, and then he sent me about 60 pages of material. So in the 21st century, I felt it was probably more responsible that I try and email it to everyone rather than print off 50 copies. So if you have your computer here or your phone and you'd like access to the PDFs throughout the talk, just send me an email and I'll fire you off the copies right here in the talk right now. And one final note, we are recording tonight's session, so please be aware of that. We'll be having a Q&A session in about 45 minutes after Bob's lecture. Okay, thanks very much, Professor. Cheers.
Oh, thank you, Nick. Let's see if the mic's on here. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out is this the last week of exams and classes? So Nick said he could either this week or next week. I guess next week it would have been you and me, Nick, if we'd just been the two of us here. So thanks for coming out. Integrity, building integrity. Integrity is one of those nice words. It sounds pretty easy to explain. It's got something to do with honesty. It's got something to do with consistency between words and action. A person of integrity is a person who's had her or his calling and insight and has dedicated his sharing or serving to those ends and has an integrated approach to life. An institution that's integrated has a vision and a mission and a strategy and an identity, all of which it impels forward to lead to productive, positive results for society. That sounds fine, but how do we get there? How do we build integrity? Building is another word that's a little unusual. Academics like words like understanding or awareness, or if they use active words related to building, it's usually deconstructing something rather than building something. But we'll talk about building in the sense of creating something new or remodeling something. And I'm impressed here by the work of people like Atul Gawande. Did you take the clicker with you, my friend, when you went? Huh? Is this it here? Down at the bottom. Oh, okay, thank you. Gawande talks about building skyscrapers, and in his wonderful book, A Checklist Manifesto, he talks about how these very complicated processes go beyond the idea of a master builder that you might have had in 1850. It has 16 or 20 different professions who have to have two kinds of checklists. One is for the activities of every day, make sure everybody's on track. And the other is, if things go wrong, and they always do, what's the process to combine the intellectual and know-how of different people to solve the problem? It's a very interesting idea. And also building has ideas from design science, where instead of trying to have the master plan, we may try to do a few things and see how they work and hope that success will spread from cell to cell. Success itself is a question of word. I think Nietzsche was the one who said success is always the great liar. And success is something that is claimed all the time for public programs, especially those which are not evaluated carefully. And so we always, in academia, we're very leery of success stories. We're leery of, well, here's what works, because we wonder if it ever could be applied to any other setting, indeed if it even applies to the setting at hand. So we clearly don't mean by success, when it comes to building integrity, having a lot of nice words. And we clearly don't mean just a bunch of activities, a bunch of workshops, seminars, we've got the plans down on paper, and we don't even mean efficiency. We don't mean we're producing something at minimum cost. We're talking about effectiveness in producing something of value. Now, with all that in mind, Nick and his colleagues have produced a little framework for what might be included in building integrity. And here's the bare bones of it. There's something about purpose, there's something about legitimacy, and then there's training, in other words, spreading the skill, and there's something about robustness, meaning evaluating inside and outside. And here's the detailed list of things that he has, it's quite a good beginning list. If you were a policymaker and somebody said, here's how you build integrity, you might find this useful to tick down the list, but of course you'd love to know a lot more. Maybe you'd even like to have an example. Wouldn't it be nice to have a real example to see how those things work? For example, an example of building integrity that had collaboration across the public-private civil society divide, where they work through a process to create that integrated mission, the vision, and where they have sort of stipulate what their metrics of success are going to be. And when they even lay out a strategic plan that says, we're going to do this together, something like those checklists when you're building a building. And also has some structural features. For example, it might have an office inside the public agency, which is tasked for making the things work across the various lines, across the 16 building trades, if you will. You may want to have something like a vision-aligned circle, which is a term of art I will explain, inside the bureaucracy at the level of tasks, where people across departments are given specific things to do and time to do it, maybe one day a week in 5. and something which they called a multi-sectoral governance council, which would go across the public-private non-profit divide, particularly to involve business people, not only in designing the vision and the mission and the strategy statement, but monitoring and helping what's going on. And finally, you might want a process which would give civil society, the citizens, a chance to hear regularly and publicly about the achievements of the integrated public organization. Wouldn't this be an example of the kinds of things Nick is talking about here? And the example I'm going to show you includes many of these features, and it works. Now, Nick mentioned that I have some documents for you. I've got a Part A and Part B teaching case for the story I'm about to tell you, which you can get from Nick. And I also have the philosophical background of this by a great genius you'll meet a little later named Jesus Stanislao, Filipino. And you'll see a wonderful vision of exactly what Nick's talking about. How do we move from fighting corruption by calling people out for doing bad things to creating organizations of real value for society, building what he calls a performance governance system. So first of all, we have to figure out what country this is. Not bad, huh? This is bad, though. The food on the left is very delicious. The one on the right is called balut. And this is an unfertilized duck egg, which you're supposed to eat raw. I stopped here, by the way. Pig's feet, fine, but balut, no. And of course, this is the Philippines. 7,000 islands, 100 million people. And in the middle of the Philippines, down here, is Cebu, an island which identifies itself a little bit like Bali. It doesn't say Bali, Indonesia, it just says Bali. They're trying to do that. Cebu, an island in the Pacific. Beautiful place, and we're going to visit it in a minute. Now first I want to see if we can play this example for us, showing this system in action.
In 2004, when Oscar Rodriguez became mayor of Pampanga's capital, the city of San Fernando, he had a primary goal: to raise its citizens' standard of living. By being a fellow at the Institute for Solidarity in Asia, he learned about the Public Governance System, or PGS, a unified management system that directs the community's efforts and knowledge towards common goals. To monitor progress, different sectors such as the mayor, the youth, civic organizations, and even the media maintain scorecards that grade their performance in achieving the city's goals.
In the process, nagkaroon kami ng change in culture on the part of the local government unit employees from a culture of well-entrenched political patronage into a service-oriented bureaucracy.
To pursue its objective of being a foremost business center, public services were revamped to meet global standards. Housing over 6,000 business establishments, San Fernando has been declared as the most business-friendly city by the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry.
Ang vision natin na ito ay maging gateway to the north, maging regional center. So with the construction of the Subic-Tarlac Expressway, the completion of the North Rail system, and papasok yung international airport dyan sa DM. Subic Seaport is one of the best in the world. Mag-a-attract ng mga international investors. And ultimately, our aim talaga ay maging lugar ito, habitat of human excellence. We envision a place where people are educated, employed, living adequately, peacefully.
In line with this goal is the Sagip Ilog project that seeks to rehabilitate the San Fernando River by relocating informal dwellers along its bank.
Binivisualize ng city government na dadating ang araw na itong lugar namin, especially San Fernando, City of San Fernando, Pampanga, na magiging squatter-free siya. Dito, 100% fully cemented yung mga karsada namin, including alley road.
This culture of efficiency is being cascaded even down to the barangay level. Barangay Sindalan, the first to have adopted a development plan through PGS, is slowly but surely reaping its benefits.
Naging maaliwalas, maganda ang trapiko, malinis ang kapaligiran, disiplinado ang mga tao. Yung pagkokolekta ng basura na nagsesegregate at gamit lamang yung tri-bike na sa pagkolekta ng basura. Nagkakaroon kami ng material recovery facility dito at nagko-compose na rin kami dito sa aming barangay.
Currently, the city of San Fernando has achieved the highest level of PGS, the institutionalized stage. But this hasn't stopped them from perfecting the system, bringing about progress and pride among its residents.
Kumbaga sa rating, underdog yung Pilipinas pagdating sa mga governance. Pero dahil nga sa magaling ang mayor natin, hindi naman tayo napag-iiwanan doon sa mga government leaders sa buong mundo. Kaya I am very proud to be a prime minister and I'm very proud to be a part of the program ng PGS.
Sa paraang malinis, sama ang mamamayay, pagsalang bago na lantar, lagdag na pagbabago, tuloy na pag-unlad, tuloy na pag-asenso.
When the music's, I know it's contagious there, but so here's the basic ideas. It's not that unfamiliar to you for thinking about any kind of strategic planning system and monitoring system.
An
There's
excellent article appeared in the January 24th
a process to try to define objectives and something to try to get a strategy and then something to try to get feedback. This one's different because each step along the way is shared. It's shared with the business community, the various parts of government, and local citizens. Here's the idea of the Institute for Solidarity of Asia was the creation of Jess Stanislaw. In the late 90s, after he was head of the central bank, Secretary of Planning, the founding dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute, president of a university, he thought with some fellow business people that they would set up something to do corporate governance in the late 90s. And in 2000, he created something for the public sector. And after they got the system set up, they chose the slogans of governance warriors. Oh, wait a second, that was a mistake. And they created this thing called the performance governance system. The system itself is modeled after the balanced scorecard system that was developed at Harvard Business School in the early 90s, which tries to get businesses to look beyond short-term profit, and also has institutional innovations such as an Office of Strategy Management within a business organization and various other tricks to try to move processes along collaboratively. It has some stages which I won't go through. You can read about them. They basically, first of all, you get some objectives. It has something specificity, tries to be time-bound. You get a strategy map, which they contrast with the usual strategic planning document, which is done by outsiders like you and me. This is done by them in 2 days, 12 to 15 objectives put on a single page. The authors of the Balanced Scorecard affectionately call it a dumbed-down strategy, but it's something everyone can see. It has a performance scorecard where each activity is given metrics over a 6-month or longer period, and there's a process that gives these vision-aligned circles about 1 day a week to work across their organizational boundaries to solve particular problems and address particular challenges. It has a full-time staff at the top, which is supposed to be like the working for the mayor or whoever's the chief executive to try to make this process happen. It has cascading, which goes from the top down all the way down through the organization. For example, the Philippines Armed Forces now has done this, and the Philippines Police has 15,000 police as part of a system of cascading down to the local police department. The multi-sectoral governance councils are public, private, nonprofit things that actually help with the strategy and feedback and so forth, but actually do things as well. And there are levels of compliance with this program. The Institute for Solidarity in Asia will come into your city or your ministry and judge when you've reached certain benchmarks and give you, in the Philippines, they love this, certificates, televised awards, and so forth, plaques at each of these stages. And here's the city of Mandaue. In 2007, when we take the story, this formerly excellent city, which had been ahead of, back in the late 90s, had been a place where some of the best furniture in the Philippines was produced and exported all over the world, had gone into decline. 2007-8 was not a kind time for many parts of Asia, but even since the late 90s, when that first economic crisis hit East Asia, this place had been suffering. A new mayor comes in. Here's his name. Jonas Cortez, he's 40 years old, and he starts off fighting the corruption, raising the revenues. He's reelected. And in 2011, a little bit into his term, he goes to visit a neighboring city. And he sees how well they're doing with the performance governance system and asks if he can get involved too. And they do. They go through the first 2 stages, but by 2013, it looked more like this. He's now, maybe you can't see, that's a tree trunk. He's stuck in 2013. And so the question we ask now is not just, is there a nice blueprint? Is there a nice model for how you do this? Actually, how do you manage this thing? How do you lead this thing? And that's what this case study is about. And so it discusses the situation in 2013. Here's what they had. Here's what they should have had. They should have had a specific time-bound vision statement, and what they had was a bunch of platitudes that motivated no one. They should have had an Office of Strategy Management that really was dynamic and propelling collaboration across the lines of the city government, and they had one that was led by line agency heads themselves who were more loyal to their line department than they were to the overarching mission. They're supposed to have strong buy-in and understanding by city employees, and these guys were all wary. You know, isn't it just extra work for me? The MSGC had the problem of free riding. Why should I go to the meeting if other people are going to go anyway? What are we getting out of this? So all these kind of classic problems of implementation occur in this situation. And what the case study is about how a leader, government business leaders, can help overcome this. And at this point, we ask students, what would you recommend? You might imagine a group of mayors here, sending them off then in groups of 4 with more details than this and have them try to work this problem. Well, what they actually did, in fact, was these 5 steps or 4 steps. They overhauled the strategy management thing. They got a hold of the city employees and figured out why they were disenfranchised and tried to comfort them and involve them and get them passionate. They created the tasks for the Multi-Sectoral Governance Council to do that, which gave them a feeling of actual efficacy and agency. They involved the disenfranchised much more with a couple of very cool tricks, and then I'll show you some results that they had. So before, as I said, key department heads were in charge of this supposedly coordinating body, and therefore when push came to shove, they didn't really give it their all. What they did instead was picked out a bunch of 35-year-old people who were kind of a little different for each department, very well trained, and they gave them a special office which they decorated with posters up the walls and around the corners, painted one wall red, and gave them a lot of help. They had a full-time head for this as well. They engaged employees by doing surveys to find out why they were recalcitrant. And then they used a locally available thing called cool camps to send people off to team building exercises that were custom designed around the process of vision, mission, strategy, and so forth. They went off. First of all, the Office of Strategy Management went off. They came back and they created these courses that went down through the organization. Then they created one dramatic initiative, which was called I Am Mandaue. It's a hashtag, and they got everybody thinking, we're going to be this new thing. We are this new Mandaue. We work for the city government. The OSM also took on the business group had an idea, since we used to be so great at furniture, maybe we can create some city stores that will show and showcase all the different crafts and stuff that we can make. Let's create these things. And everybody thought that was a great idea, but it involved permits, it involved siting, it involved a lot of things where the business community, it wasn't its comparative advantage. So the government said, we'll do it, but then who's going to do it? No department wanted to do it. And so the OSM stepped up and did the first store. And once they did it, everybody else said, okay, if this can be done, let's go ahead and do it. Finally, they appreciate and propagate what works. They studied the plans of each of these vision-aligned circles, and they had meetings every week. And when things went right, they would share those things that went right and celebrate them throughout the organization. The Multi-Sectoral Governance Council did not have the poor as members. And what they did was, afterwards, they said, you should not just support us, you should do something. What's a project you could do to help our small and medium-sized enterprises go ahead? And they said, you know what we're good at, they're not good at, is labeling and packaging. So they went off and set up a project working with the small and medium-sized enterprises, and it worked. It gave them a lot of pride. They moved ahead. They had a summit meeting to get the poor people. 400 civic association groups came together with the mayor and the MSGC, and they created an enthusiasm for joining, in which then 20 of the poor organizations joined this council. The disenfranchised, before the idea was, you get off the riverbank, move out, get out of here. And now they changed to something where they actually involved architects and local people to help them figure out, okay, if you have a choice, you can either move over here, in which case we give you some money, you have to help build the thing that you design with our architects, or we'll give you some money, you have to move somewhere else, but I'm sorry, you have to go. And by using local leaders and the idea of civic dignity as a mantra, this actually created an entirely different gestalt to the way the poor interacted with the government, and it worked. The results were amazing. Revenues were up, debt was down. Lots of good things happened in terms of spending. And also there were lots of awards they won, even over a 3-year period. They just won all these awards, and culminating with, in 2015 in November, when the APEC meeting was in Manila, they and 11 other organizations, 6 cities and 6 federal agencies, were honored with the Island of Good Governance, which means they had externally audited breakthrough results for the citizens of and the clients and customers. One of the representatives locally said, it's just like night and day. You watch how people feel about the city, you watch how the employees feel about the city, the morale and the results have just transformed this place completely. Now this is the guy who designed it, and I want to talk about some of the lessons he has about moving from what to how. Now he starts off in another document you can get when you send a note to Nick or to me. You get another document that he wrote in late 2014, which is about the principles and philosophy, operational philosophy behind building integrity instead of fighting corruption. And he says, for Asians, we could talk about corruption, but that's not the way we should do it. We should try to move in a positive direction. And then accountability can be something much more than just finding out bad things. It can be something much more positive, where we're trying to show good results. And you can read about that. It's really an impressive document. He has a formula he announces in that thing, which he basically describes what an integrated or integral government should look like. It should have the shared responsibility. It should have the shared responsibility, shared vision, shared responsibility, and some shared mechanism of accountability. And that's what he calls sustainability. And he describes how these mechanisms work to create each of these things. He points out that at each stage of the process, from the high vision all the way down to the feedback about every 6 months when they have these evaluations, every one of them is a convening of people that treats people's opinions with dignity and with paying a lot of attention. The logic of implementation has 3 parts that he emphasizes. One is you focus on a task. You don't try to do 12 things at once. You engage people's hearts as well as their heads, consistent with many books on change management, such as one they read by Heath and Heath called Shift, a 2010 book by the Stanford professor Chip Heath and his brother, who's a management consultant, a wonderful book about change. And they went through that book together, and they realized this is more than just knowledge we need. This is an actual identification and getting everybody involved passionately. And then learning another point they picked up from that book, which is the positive deviance idea, where you study success and try to learn what's going on in success in your own organization. I like this too. He says, precisely because it's systemic, work on governance cannot be limited to a single issue or selected issues. It has to be comprehensive. Okay, this is something academics love. We love to take the whole thing into account. But also, the systemic character of the work is not affected by the fact you have to look at one thing at a time. Begin with small things, begin with strong things, and help them grow and spread. So when they began with 8 cities, those mayors started succeeding with investment and re-election. Other mayors noticed, other agencies noticed, and by the time Aquino came in 2010, he said, I want this for the whole government. Let's do this everywhere. And they have boot camps every 6 months for PGS boot camps, second courses, that they can really work this through. So here are a few other how-to hints that we could take away for general management. You could say, well, one of them is a blueprint is not enough. And you study this case and help students and practitioners see, what more is there than just saying, well, here's my plan. There's a lot more. And it includes things like coordination should be something that's a full-time job by people who don't think their job is bossing people around, but enabling people to collaborate. It also includes employee engagement through this hearts and heads thing. The case has a lot of detail about how they did this, which is quite interesting. Symbolic initiatives, things that stand out to people. The I Am Mandawe one was also a website, and they had buildings decorated with I Am Mandawe. The stores were points of pride. The packaging and labeling program became something that the business people were very, very proud of. Propagating the things that work, dealing with collective action challenges by understanding that it's there. No one wants to be the only person that comes to the meeting or even come to the meeting at all. You want to be doing that only if there's something beneficial that you can feel yourself. And finally, the summit meetings with the poor broke the ice. And who convenes that is crucial. It turned out here the mayor was the person who did it, and it worked. All right, now let's talk about a slightly different problem here. Suppose we have some success stories, and I know we're a little skeptical of success stories, but suppose we have a bunch of them. We could talk in the case of corruption about, I think there's probably 10 or 12 or 15 that are very interesting. How could we learn from something as different as Mandawe for some other part of the world? Here's a story about Clay Christensen, the Harvard professor who invented the idea of disruptive change. Disruptive innovation. He was invited by the chair of Intel to come to Intel and tell Intel's board members about how Clay Christensen's theory of disruptive innovation would affect the chip business. So he went there, and but before he did, about a month before, he had an epiphany. He said, you know what, he's got a lot of money, had research assistants working on the chip. I'm not going to do the chip business. I'm going to tell them a theory-laden story about how disruptive innovation worked in another industry and see if they can make the connection. So he goes to the meeting, he sits down at lunchtime with the board. He reports this later in a 2013 article. And he starts this story, and I don't know what the reaction immediately was by the people there. But they're all following it very closely, and about halfway through, Grove goes, okay, I got it. You guys got it? Of course, if Grove says he's got it, everybody else says, yes, we've got it, boss. And then they went on to analyze their industry using Christensen's tools better than Christensen could himself. Later he said, that experience had a profound effect on me. When people ask what I think they should do, I rarely answer their question directly. Instead, I run the question through one of my models. He has a model, he has a theory. I then describe how the process worked its way through in an industry quite different from theirs, in a setting, a country quite different from theirs. And then, more often than not, they'll say, okay, I got it. And they'll answer their own question more insightfully than I could have. Now, Aquino, when he took over in Peru in 2010, his campaign slogan was, where there's no corruption, there's no poverty. And then 3 weeks into office, they all kind of went, as new ministers, great cabinet, they all kind of went, so what do we do now? Because the president in his inauguration speech had said two things. I'm serious, and here's a hotline, call me. And they had 1,500 complaints in the first 3 weeks. And he gave it to the Minister of Finance to please handle that problem. So they had a retreat, or I call it a convening, on a Saturday in Malacañang Palace, the president not there, the cabinet, the head of the armed forces, the head of the tax bureau, the head of the customs bureau, the head of the central bank. So we had 15 people in golf shirts, and what did they do there? They asked what will work here, and in this convening, they looked at the facts on the Philippines. Here's what the data show you about, this is not just a goody-goody issue, this is a serious constraint. Your governance problems are a constraint on investment and performance and dealing with the poor. Here's a framework that might be useful to you. Something like Christensen's framework about disruptive innovation, but it's not a framework like that. It's a framework about the economics of corruption, pointing out there are certain situations where this crime of calculation becomes embedded. And there are therefore certain principles for how you can extract yourself from that situation. That's always good news, by the way, for people working on corruption or integrity, to realize it's not a problem of their culture, their morality, their ethics, but a problem of systems that have gone awry. And finally, case studies. So look at another country that has been successful, a very different place. I teach at Harvard Business School style in what we call a live case. You have 10 minutes or so to present the basic facts of the case with a couple of handouts. Then we move these guys out in 4 groups of 4, and they come back 45 minutes later with their recommendations for what they should do. Now, in doing that, they've Rorschached their own problems onto that problem, but they come back and they're good at this stuff. And they've made a little fun doing it together in fours. They present their stuff, and then we show them what actually happened in part B. And the first thing they say is, well, that's interesting. That's quite different from our country. And the second thing they say is, but it's interesting how they started with this and sidelined these people over here and how they emphasize this. And pretty soon they start getting ideas. My incipient hypotheses about what this means for the work we do at places like the Blavatnik School. As policy researchers, we can provide people with certain inputs to help them figure out what might work where they are. And we have a process for doing that, which might last a day or two. It has to be private. It has to be Chatham House rules. You have to have the right choice of data, cases, and frameworks. You have to listen very carefully to their problems way in advance to know what to present here. And multiple actors can get together, sometimes across the public-private divide, to have a follow-up which is catalyzing flows of information back to them. So we might think of this as policy analysis and evaluation 2.0. What is 1.0? 1.0 is you've got a decision maker. Here's the mayor. She's got a choice between three well-specified alternatives. She's got an objective function she's told you about, and you as the policy analyst wizard figure out, well, if you do this, it'll have these effects on your objective function. Here's the political constraints. Here's the administrative problems. Do B. And she says, thank you. And she does it, and it works, and we all go, ta-da. Well, when I was dean at RAND, we did studies of 25 or 30 of RAND's greatest studies with greatest impact. And then we had a conference of think tanks from around the world where they brought along their studies, which they thought had the greatest impact. And there was only one that looked like this. The other ones had a different reality. And here's what that different reality is. First of all, it's not one decision maker. There's a bunch of decision makers here, sometimes in the same organization, sometimes across many organizations. It's not one decision. There's a bunch of decisions, and they're not clear what the objectives are. It's not a well-specified operations research problem. Even the alternatives may be enhanced by careful analysis. Incomplete data and imperfect models are in store for us. It's not something we can just sit down and do the econometric or the RCT. And they need data, examples, and frameworks to help them think this through. Not in a report, but in some sort of event, which I call a convening. So if you look at this, Policy Analysis and Evaluation 2.0, this means that what we should be trying to do in our teaching and our research as one of our outputs, along with our journal articles, as long as with our courses on econometrics, we ought to be doing things like this. And so what does that imply? It means after we do our research, so you've got your evaluation study of welfare reform, you've got your study of what happens to migrants when they get over here, then you ask these questions in addition. You ask, how could this research that I've done help people rethink the problem altogether? Do I have anything that, is the discourse stuck? Is there any way I could help shake that up a little bit? Secondly, is there anything I can help them do to add an objective or rethink the objectives? Do they remember this objective? Sometimes they go, oh my God, never thought of that. Is there an alternative they haven't got on the table, which my research suggests they might explore? Is there a chance to get different actors to think about this together and kindle some creative problem solving that the current system does not allow? Is there a way that we could institutionally build some relationships over time of the actors that are going to have to work together on these issues for the next years? And for universities or for places like the Blavatnik School, this has implications too. I believe we have to expand our mission beside teaching, research, and service to include taking on big issues facing our society. Nobody else will do this credibly. We have our own credibility problems, but this is our comparative advantage. It should be. And that means we have to encourage our students not just to write the publishable article or the dissertation that'll get done, and not just ourselves to stick in our own silos and write those papers, which, 3 years from now people are still reading, but 30 years from now didn't make much difference. Instead, try to encourage ourselves institutionally, both with our hearts and our heads, to take on bigger questions together. And what we teach, we have to go beyond policy analysis 1.0, much as we love those things. I don't mean excluding them, I mean adding on to them questions that we've just been talking about. Let me have a final thought to leave you, then I'll make my 45-minute deadline here, Nick. This is William James, the founder of American psychology and perhaps the first of our philosophers as well, a pragmatist, an amazing polymath, and quite an interesting fellow. He always blended detailed research with talks to the public. And in 1914, one of his books I think it was called Talks with Teachers on Life's Big Questions or something, we'll get the reference in a second, was published right before he died. And this was a talk he gave really about a decade earlier. And the question he was asking was, how do you get people to change? Do you think you have to change their attitudes in order to change their behavior? And he said, actually, there's no better known or more generally useful precept in the moral training of youth or in one's personal self-discipline than that which bids us to pay primary attention to what we do and express and not to care too much for what we feel. What's our attitude about that? And he goes on to say, thus, the sovereign voluntary path to cheerfulness, if our spontaneous cheerfulness be lost, is to sit up cheerfully, to look around cheerfully. All of you are doing that now, right? And to act and speak as if cheerfulness were already there. If such conduct does not make you soon feel cheerful, nothing else on that occasion can. And so to feel brave, act as if we were brave, use all our will to that end, and a courage fit will very likely replace the fit of fear. Again, in order to feel kindly toward a person with whom we have been inimical, the only way is to more or less deliberately smile, make sympathetic inquiries, and force ourselves to say genial things. Now, the implication for our work is, when we go into places that lack integrity, it may not be the best idea to go say, you guys lack integrity. You really ought to change your attitudes and values. It might be better to say, we have some performance-enhancing tricks that we've learned. They have to be tailored to your situation. Would you like to see some of them? We can show you some. We can introduce you to some very cool ways to think about things, and you could decide. So trying to focus on the behavior, trying to focus on performance rather than values and attitudes may be one of the keys to our building integrity. Okay, thank you very much, and now here are your thoughts. There's my Gmail address. If you'd like to write me or send me anything, that'd be great. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
Cheerful comments. Yes.
Thank you for your talk, Bob. I would like to ask you whether you think that the framework that you just presented, if you would sort of follow a similar methodology when it applies to international organizations like the World Bank or the IMF.
Yes. The answer is yes. And so I'll give you one quick example. Remember Arab Spring, which was so hopeful a while back? Remember how hopeful we all were? Suddenly there's Libya and there's all these countries, and we thought, oh my God. So I was talking to a very high person at the World Bank and asked him or her, what are you guys going to do about this? What if they come to you 6 months from now and ask you for big help? What are you going to do? We haven't thought about that. And so we talked about the principle of a convening. Could you do a convening within the World Bank across your many vice presidencies in key functional areas and discuss that? And she or he said, could you do that? I said, sure, I'll do it for free. So we did it one afternoon. It went on till 8 at night. Nobody wanted to go home. And they came up. We had data, we had examples, and we had a process which looks like this, Melita. Imagine this. Everybody had their ideas, and we had an imaginary news story of great success for the World Bank in this region 5 years hence, which I'd made up. Everybody had to read it aloud. And then at the end it says continued page A9, and there's no page A9. So then the proposition is, how would you get from here to there? What can you imagine might have happened if we said the World Bank had done that? What would happen? And you spend 5 minutes, each of you spends 5 minutes doing it, and then you share with the person sitting next to you what your ideas are. And the rule is, you're going to report back what you think his best idea was. And you're going to report, so there's a lot of attentive listening, because you know she's going to report back what you said. And then we write all the best ideas on the board, and then these guys took off. It was incredible. They had a lot of great ideas. Unfortunately, the Arab Spring didn't quite live up to expectations, but the process worked very well. Yes.
Thank you very much. I came in midway into your talk, but nonetheless, I think I got the meat of it. I'm curious.
Just like Andy Grove. I got it.
I'm just curious to know, how do you overcome cynicism, in cultures where they've seen a lot of consultants, they've seen a lot of frameworks about what works in the public sector, and then there's still deep-seated problems around corruption and integrity, So when you come around, you present these beautiful frameworks. They've probably seen 1,001 of such previous presentations that they tried, and then it was just short-lived. Yeah. So how do you overcome that cynicism and get the buy-in from the stakeholders?
Right. Well, the two dangers that inhibit reform are ignorance and cynicism. And a way to combat them is with real examples of success, ideally from their own society. So I'll give you a quick example. In November, I was at a meeting in China. It was right the week after they had that big meeting of the 400, getting ready for the Politburo meeting, and they focused on state reform. And their idea was they have a bunch of visions for China. They have a really nice vision China, very cool, very inspiring. But their big idea is we're going to make the 95 million party members sweat and furrow their brows by inspecting them and punishing them. It was a big idea. The guy presented this. And you kind of go, let's see, I want my child to change her behavior, so what I'm going to do is inspect and punish. Is there something else to this? They have the inspirational part. And then the question is, can they combat the cynicism by studying success? So they identified certain areas of priority. For example, land seizing was a big problem. People hate that. They notice what people hate. So what I proposed to them is, let's go find in your 1.3 billion people, your 95 million party members, what are some examples of bright spots now that you're already doing well in dealing with the people? They had things like overcome arrogance, no display, efficient performance, all these good things. Let's find some examples in these 4 areas. Let's warrant them. Let's make sure the business sector and the private people say that's true, it was a success, not just some official saying, hey, we did really well. And then let's you and I do a case study with them which shows how they did it. And then let's start propagating those success stories, just like they did in the Philippines. Get the 8 success stories, share those things, share how they worked. And then the cynicism, let's put it this way, if it doesn't evaporate because of that, there's nothing you and I could do at that moment to do better. Because there's no general answer to changing a culture of cynicism that I know of. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much. Your model 2.0, I think, resonates quite a lot with me. I work in government, and often we describe the way we make decisions quite different to the way people from outside the government think you make decisions, which is you have a whole lot of options with perfectly known outcomes and quite clear-cut decisions, and you obviously stew on them and then make the worst decision possible. That's what everybody else thinks. The way we describe it is usually the lesser of several evils, or that you don't really have much in the way of decisions to make. And one of the problems I often find is we don't take into account learning and how we actually have failed in the past. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on how your model would account for that learning process.
Those are perfect questions, and I'm afraid I can't elaborate too much because of time. But would you please send Nick or me an email, and we'll send you these studies, because this principle is very much in the philosophy, and the case study exhibits it so beautifully. That again, it's not something you're going to just copy and say, oh, let's just do that, but it will inspire you that it can be done. And then you have some guidelines, a checklist, if you will, that will help you say, well, could we do this here? And then imagine a convening in your organization where you say, look, here's some examples of things that are working somewhere else. Here's a framework. Think this might work for us? And if they say no, then you still be as cheerful as you can. How about one from you, Nick? You're the mastermind of this organization.
I was going to ask about, so the Philippines is a particularly interesting example given now the presidency of Duterte. And I know you were specifically talking about the changes within cities within the Philippines, but you also elaborated that it was something that had moved to a broader national level within the Philippines.
Yes.
So what's happened there? What is there been a breakdown? Is there a link between all this push and then suddenly having a push back? Is it just coincidence?
The answer is I don't know. And that's refreshing to hear from a professor, I'm sure. Right? It's not something we usually say, unless we have somebody torturing us. There's a new paper about 2 weeks ago by an American, Filipino-Lebanese American. So he went back to the Philippines after something like 23 years. He's probably in his 30s, so he'd probably been there since he's 12 or something. His mom's a Filipina, still there, and married to a Lebanese who dumped her after a while. And the family is all very successful, except for one of the uncles who became a drug addict and his brain is fried. And everybody in the family looks at this and say, oh man, drugs are so bad. They're just eating our society up. So you immediately get that picture of the drug problem, which Duterte jumped on. And this guy is shocked to find out that all 12 of the relatives he's visiting think Duterte is great. Reminds me of a friend of mine in America who's a very successful businessman and went back home to Michigan, where his family is from. And his family is a very conservative Christian family. And he thought, oh, they're going to hate this womanizing idiot, you know. And all 19 of his family members said, oh, Trump, oh, good guy, Trump. He's mystified by it. So something's going on here which I don't pretend to understand. That's true of a lot of the world since the last year, that I don't really understand what's going on with these great political movements of populism and conservatism. They often use words like corruption. When Trump ran against Washington, it was because of institutionalized corruption. When Duterte talks about the drug business, he says it's corrupting our country and it's corrupting the police and so forth. So the answer is I really don't know about your question, but it's a good one. I will say that the Philippines' institutional things we're talking about here, this performance governance system, is still strong and has cascaded down through the bureaucracy. When I was at the Revalida in November 2015 and they awarded the Philippine Armed Forces this, one of these 12 islands of good governance, I think I told you before that we asked a Navy guy, so what happens if a new admiral comes in and changes this thing? And this guy said, since we started this, we've had 8 admirals in charge. This thing is now cascaded down on the organization. It'd be extremely hard to extricate the Philippine Navy from the performance governance system. Yes?
This isn't a brilliantly formulated question, but I just wanted to pick up on the idea of islands of good governance.
A little louder, please.
I just wanted to pick up on the idea of islands of good governance.
Yes.
And the kind of the power of positive examples.
Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar with there's a TV program in Nepal called Integrity Idol.
No.
It's kind of like Pop Idol, but for public servants.
Oh yes, there's a chapter in Britain who helped run that, isn't it? What's that organization called? He sent me some stuff about this.
Integrity Lab, I think it is,
that's
or something like that.
Integrity Lab, yes, that's right.
Yeah, so, I mean, I was in a workshop with those people last year, and my big question to them was, what happens if your TV star is then found out to be not as great a guy as everyone thought in the first place?
Yeah.
And your example of the Arab Spring, right? All of these positive cases are on a moving carpet, and some will probably stay positive and others will fall down. So I don't know if you know about examples of this, I'd love to hear it, but when you have these islands of excellence, perhaps that's the wrong approach. Perhaps you need to create networks of excellence as soon as you copy the positive example that learn about what's working well, because they won't probably all stay excellent. I don't know if there's any examples.
I do have. This is, I'm sorry, I keep hand waving and saying, please read this thing by Stanislaw, because he talks about exactly this problem. He says, when we start, we have to have a comprehensive view from the top, but we have to move cell by cell from the bottom. And we have to hope that these practices will spread. They're going to be copied, there's going to be changed, adapted, and so forth, and we have to keep revisiting them. Because once you stop looking at them, they just can die away. I will notice, though, that I want to notice, not to criticize at all what you're saying, I will notice a certain tendency by those of us who have been in academia, and maybe even practitioners. When people say, we got a new teaching technology that works, we go, yeah, right. My doctoral dissertation was on unusually effective schools. And only because we could show statistically that they performed, 50th to 65th percentile after control. As soon as you said it, people just said, no, can't do it. So our cynicism and our belief, especially about some of these difficult emotional issues like overcoming inequality or helping the very poorest or trying to change the power structure or fighting corruption, we're so sure nothing can be done that we kind of give up before we start. So I do hear you that some of these success stories do backslide because there are forces the other way. So effective schools can become bad schools. But nonetheless, the principles are not so much political science perspective would be, why did that school jump up? Or where did this mayor come from, right? Or why did Lee Kuan Yew, what was his family background? Why did he, and I just go, forget about that. What did he do that seemed to have that big effect? It wasn't because he sat there and emanated magnetic field around him. He did some specific things. What can we learn from those, knowing that we're not Lee Kuan Yew? So that's your question is exactly the point. How can we grab principles and examples that would help people be inspired to solve their own problems in new ways? Who else?
Thank you. I'm wondering how this positive framework compares to what's happening in Brazil right now, where the judicial system is apparently the last institution that is taking this problem up front and
it's a great
doing
question.
something about it, and how the two perhaps might cooperate.
I'm not an expert on Brazil. Last year I got a call from an email from a woman who's a journalist there, and she said, then we talked on the phone, she said, people in Brazil say Brazilian culture, we talked about this in class, Brazilian culture is corrupt. What do you think? We can't do anything about it because it's corrupt. President of Mexico 2 years ago said, maybe our problem is that our culture is corrupt. Nigerians told your dean, you can't do anything about this, it's our culture. She does a better impersonation of accents than anybody I know. It's our culture. So as soon as you say culture, people then just say you can't do anything about it. But what we've seen in Brazil is a remarkable thing. This group of prosecutors in this case have been fearless. They're amazing people. I got to meet a couple of them last year down in Latin America. They're impressive professionals. You would recognize them as professionals in Finland or Hong Kong or anywhere. These guys are right there. And the public is supporting them. About a week and a half ago on the BBC, they had a show that Owen Bennett-Jones does once a week where they take one issue for an hour. I think it's called, I forget what it's called. But anyway, he did it on Brazil. And they had the people reported the following fact. 90% of Brazilian people support the prosecutors going after Lava Jato and all the implications of getting their favorite people like Lula and some of those guys, even though they realize that it's disrupting the economy and putting their place in chaos because they're so angry about corruption. And so when that woman called me, I said, I hope you're emphasizing the good news here, which is you've got some very honest prosecutors and the institutional system, the judges also taking care of these guys. So you start there. There's your bright spots. What are they doing? How do they do that? And how can we learn from that for the rest of society? Yeah. One more thing before we go. There's an area in psychology called positive psychology, invented about 20 years ago by Martin Seligman after he became the president of the American Psychological Association. He and one of our professors, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the guy who wrote Flow, started a field which basic idea was, most psychology teaches you how to go from broken person, neurotic, mentally ill, to normal. How about from normal to amazing, disciplined, creative, joyous, and not just pop psychology? You got plenty of books that do that, but how about real science? And so they started a movement called positive psychology, and you could look up at our university, Claremont Graduate University. We have the first PhD program in this area. And there's also positive organizational psychology, Nick. Take a look there and see what lessons they're pulling down. But it is true that once we start looking at things that are more inspiring and more, it sort of cheers us up, doesn't it? It kind of cheers us up, even if we sit back and say, yeah, I don't know if that's going to last. I don't know, maybe Duterte will come, So that we have to keep that side of our brain working too, but we also should focus on the things that work. And I hope you do that with your Building Integrity program. Okay, so thanks very much. And those of you down at the end, you get special gifts or bribes as you leave.
Okay, well, if we could all just thank Professor Klitgaard for his lecture. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.